September 29th, 1982, suburban Chicago. A quiet Wednesday morning. In a modest home, 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up feeling a bit under the weather. A minor cold, nothing serious. She did what millions of Americans do without a second thought. Reached for a bottle of Tylenol, swallowed a single capsule, and waited for relief. But instead, just minutes later, she collapsed. By the time her parents reached her, Mary was unresponsive. At the hospital, doctors struggled to make sense of how a healthy young girl could die so suddenly. But Mary's story was only the beginning. That same evening, in the nearby suburb of Arlington Heights, a seemingly unrelated tragedy unfolded. Adam Janus, 27, took Tylenol for mild chest pain. Hours later, he was dead. Grief-stricken, his family gathered at his home to mourn. In a cruel twist, both his younger brother Stanley and Stanley's new wife, Teresa, also reached for the same bottle, seeking comfort for their own aches. Within hours, both collapsed and died, one after the other, right there in the Janus family home. What was happening in Chicago's quiet neighborhoods? Was it a coincidence, or something far more sinister? How could ordinary, over-the-counter medicine turn deadly? And who, if anyone, could be behind it? By nightfall, the headlines were already racing ahead of the facts. A deadly threat was spreading, one that could strike anyone, anywhere, at any moment. Unseen, untraceable, terrifying in its randomness. Little did anyone realize, those unassuming capsules held a secret. Someone, somewhere, had turned everyday medicine into a weapon. The panic that would follow was only just beginning. The victims, lives interrupted. To truly understand the impact of the Tylenol murders, we must step back and look at the lives behind the headlines. Ordinary people whose routines were shattered in a matter of minutes. Mary Kellerman was just 12 years old, a bright, cheerful seventh grader. She woke up on that September morning with a slight cold, nothing her family hadn't seen before. Her parents, Dennis and Gianna, hoped a simple Tylenol would help her bounce back in time for school. But within minutes, their world was upended. Adam Janus was 27, a hard-working postal worker in Arlington Heights. On that fateful afternoon, he came home complaining of chest pains, a minor discomfort, the kind that barely interrupts the day. He reached for Tylenol, like millions of Americans do, trusting it to ease his pain. Moments later, Adam collapsed. He died so quickly, doctors could offer no explanation. The tragedy deepened in the Janus household. As the family gathered to mourn Adam's sudden passing, his younger brother Stanley, just 25, and Stanley's wife Teresa, 20, also took Tylenol from the same bottle. Within hours, both were dead. 3 members of one family, lost in a single day to an invisible enemy. But the wave of sorrow did not stop there. Mary Lynn Reiner, 27, was a new mother in Winfield, still adjusting to life with a newborn. Seeking relief from postpartum aches, she took Tylenol at home, never imagining the consequences. Mary McFarland, 31, a dependable Illinois Bell employee from Lombard, swallowed a Tylenol for a routine headache during her shift. Minutes later, co-workers watched in shock as she collapsed at work. And finally, Paula Prince, 35, a United Airlines flight attendant. Surveillance cameras caught her purchasing Tylenol at a Walgreens on North Wells Street. Later, Paula was found lifeless in her apartment, her bottle of Tylenol already opened. All of these victims had one thing in common: the belief that relief was just a pill away. Instead, their stories would become chapters in one of America's most chilling and senseless crimes. Cracks in the system. At first glance, the Tylenol deaths seemed random, isolated tragedies that struck down healthy individuals. But beneath the surface, investigators soon realized these weren't acts of fate. There were cracks in the system, vulnerabilities so subtle that no one noticed until it was too late. Unlike today, in 1982, over-the-counter medications like Tylenol came in capsules, small, two-part shells that could be opened and resealed with ease. There was no tamper-evident seal, no plastic ring or foil barrier to guarantee the contents inside hadn't been disturbed. Millions of Americans, trusting and unsuspecting, took their medicine straight from the bottle, never questioning its safety. And the way these products reached consumers only amplified the danger. Tylenol was everywhere, stocked on the shelves of national chains like Walgreens, Dominic's, Jewel, and Osco. But this vast, decentralized retail web made tracing any single bottle nearly impossible. Every store received shipments from multiple warehouses. Each customer picked from hundreds of bottles, each from a different batch. The random nature of the victims, young and old, men and women spread across different towns, sent a wave of fear throughout the region. If no one was safe, how could anyone protect themselves? It wasn't a feud between people, nor a targeted act of violence. The real conflict was a silent one, between a society's trust in its everyday products and the hidden dangers lurking in plain sight. There had been no warning signs, no threats, no demands, at least not yet. Just a series of ordinary pills, turned into deadly weapons by an unseen hand. The public grew anxious. Parents hid their medicine bottles. Shelves emptied in a panic. For the first time, Americans realized that even the most mundane object in their home could become a source of mortal danger. Could something so innocent, so everyday, really be used against them? If the system was broken, who would pay the price? The night it happened. The timeline of September 29, 1982, would later be dissected by investigators, journalists, and an anxious public searching for answers. The day began like any other, but within hours, a series of tragedies would trigger a nationwide panic. Early that morning, Mary Kellerman's sudden collapse stunned both her family and hospital staff. She had seemed healthy, just a bit under the weather. The speed of her decline left doctors baffled. Was it a rare allergic reaction? An undiagnosed illness? Nothing made sense. By midday, the pattern of the day was already shifting from mystery to horror. In Arlington Heights, Adam Janus died after taking Tylenol for mild chest pain. His unexpected death left his family reeling. But grief would give way to shock as, that very evening, Adam's younger brother, Stanley, and Stanley's newlywed wife, Teresa, also fell ill, each having taken Tylenol from the same bottle. Within hours, both were gone. Word spread quickly through the Janus home and then through the neighborhood. Something was terribly wrong. By nightfall, police officers in Arlington Heights were driving through the streets with bullhorns, warning residents, "Do not take Tylenol." The message was urgent, the tone desperate. But the nightmare didn't end there. Over the next 24 hours, the pattern repeated. Mary Lynn Reiner, a new mother from Winfield, collapsed at home after taking Tylenol. In Lombard, Mary McFarland, a reliable Illinois Bell employee, was struck down by a headache. Minutes later, she was unconscious. And in Chicago, Paula Prince bought a bottle of Tylenol at Walgreens on North Wells Street. Surveillance footage captured her last moments alive. Soon after, she was found dead in her apartment, her Tylenol bottle open on the counter. By the morning of September 30th, Hospitals, police, and local officials began to connect the dots. Multiple deaths, multiple towns, one common link: Tylenol. What began as a trickle of isolated incidents had become a flood of terror. The manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson, at first issued a limited recall, hoping to contain the threat. But as the death toll rose, it became clear this was no manufacturing error. By early October, a nationwide recall was underway. 31 million bottles of Tylenol were pulled from shelves. In a matter of weeks, Tylenol's market share dropped from over 35% to just 8%. The community was left reeling. Fear hung over Chicago, touching every family, every medicine cabinet. The events of that night would mark a turning point, not just for one company or one city, but for an entire nation's sense of security. The investigation. In the chaos that followed the string of deaths, law enforcement agencies scrambled to connect the dots. Who, or what, was behind the Tylenol killings? Was it a freak accident, a manufacturing error, or a deliberate act? The answers would come only through relentless investigation and careful forensic work. The first breakthrough came thanks to a local community nurse, Helen Jensen. Jensen, a seasoned public health worker, painstakingly tracked down a bottle of Tylenol from the Janus family's home, one that had been purchased the very day of Adam's death. When the bottle was tested, doctors and forensic specialists noted an unmistakable odor, the bitter scent of almonds, a telltale sign of cyanide. Now, with cyanide poisoning confirmed, investigators realized these were not isolated medical mysteries. They were homicides. The urgency grew. Teams fanned out across Chicago and its suburbs, seizing Tylenol bottles from pharmacies, supermarkets, and homes. The scale of the threat was staggering. Surveillance footage, retail records, and distribution logs were all scrutinized. Investigators traced contaminated bottles to various stores: Walgreens, Dominic's, Jewel, Osco, spanning different neighborhoods. The bottles came from different batches, manufactured at different plants across Texas and Pennsylvania. This critical discovery ruled out contamination at the factory. The poisonings must have occurred after the products had reached store shelves. Forensic teams examined the capsules themselves. Under the microscope, it was clear that the two-part capsules had been opened, filled with potassium cyanide, and resealed with chilling precision. In some bottles, only a handful of capsules were poisoned, but the cyanide levels were enough to kill instantly. Analytical chemists published detailed studies, setting forensic benchmarks for identifying cyanide in consumer goods. Their work would help define a new standard for tampering investigations. With manufacturing issues ruled out, the investigation turned toward the possibility of a saboteur, a person moving through Chicago, quietly, methodically, turning trusted medicine into instruments of death. But who could it be? Was it someone with a personal vendetta, or a stranger bent on sowing chaos? Each new clue brought fresh urgency. Every bottle pulled from a shelf felt like a race against time. But as the days passed, the face behind the terror remained hidden, and Chicago held its breath. The turning point. For days, the city was gripped by fear. Tylenol bottles disappeared from store shelves. News anchors delivered updates with trembling voices. Investigators chased every lead, but the case remained shrouded in uncertainty, until a series of breakthroughs shifted the investigation in a new direction. The first turning point came with the official confirmation. All the victims had died from cyanide poisoning. With this revelation, the case transformed from a baffling medical mystery into an unmistakable act of murder. What had begun as isolated tragedies was now recognized as a coordinated, intentional attack. The second critical development was the discovery that the tainted Tylenol capsules came from different batches and were manufactured in different facilities, some in Texas, others in Pennsylvania. This finding was decisive. It eliminated the possibility of a factory-wide contamination or an accidental chemical mix-up. The focus narrowed. Someone had tampered with the capsules after they had already reached store shelves. The culprit had struck at the very point where consumer trust was absolute. Then, an unexpected twist. A ransom letter arrived at Johnson & Johnson headquarters. The author demanded $1 million to stop the killing. The letter was signed with a chilling threat, and for the first time, investigators had a suspect. James W. Lewis, a man with a history of fraud, was arrested and convicted for extortion. Yet, despite the notoriety and media frenzy, Lewis was never charged with the murders. There was no evidence linking him to the actual tampering. The real killer, it seemed, was still out there. Meanwhile, Johnson & Johnson, in a bold and unprecedented move, ordered a nationwide recall of every Tylenol product, over 31 million bottles, at a staggering financial cost. The company launched a public campaign urging Americans not to use any Tylenol unless it was verified safe. Working hand in hand with the FBI and FDA, Johnson & Johnson helped to contain the crisis, prevent further deaths, and set a new industry standard for transparency. This swift response became a turning point, not only for the investigation, but for the future of consumer safety. New tamper-proof packaging would soon be required by law. Yet even as the city took cautious steps toward normalcy, the haunting question remained. Who was behind the Tylenol murders, and would they ever be brought to justice? As investigators worked around the clock, public hope for justice grew. Yet as weeks turned to months and months to years, the Tylenol case refused to yield clear answers. Despite an unprecedented effort, the search for the person responsible for poisoning America's trust remained frustratingly incomplete. The most prominent suspect, James W. Lewis, stood trial not for murder, but for extortion. His ransom letter had threatened Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million in exchange for ending the deaths. In court, Lewis was convicted and sentenced for attempted extortion, but investigators could never tie him directly to the bottles that took 7 lives. Years later, Lewis would be questioned again, his DNA compared against samples taken from the tampered Tylenol capsules, but no definitive match was ever found. Lewis died in 2023, and with his passing, one of the case's few solid leads faded into history. Another name surfaced in the investigation: Roger Arnold, a man with indirect links to the case and a troubling personal history. For a time, Arnold drew intense scrutiny, but as the facts emerged, he was eliminated as a suspect in the Tylenol killings. Later, he would be convicted for a different, unrelated homicide, a grim footnote to an already tragic story. Even the infamous Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, was compared as a possible suspect, but DNA analysis ruled him out. Each investigative thread seemed to unravel, leaving the case open, unsolved, a chilling testament to the power and limits of forensic science in the early 1980s. No one has ever been convicted of the Tylenol murders. The case remains officially open. For the families of the victims and for millions of Americans, the lack of resolution left scars, echoes of fear, anger, and profound loss. But out of the tragedy, something else was born, a transformation in how we protect consumers. The legacy of those 7 lives lost would ripple far beyond Chicago, shaping the future of product safety for generations. Aftermath and lessons learned. In the wake of the Tylenol tragedy, America changed. The murders had exposed a terrifying vulnerability. In a world increasingly dependent on packaged goods, even a tiny flaw in a bottle's design could become an open door for disaster. The shockwaves were immediate and far-reaching, rippling through homes, industries, and government halls. Congress responded with urgency, passing the Federal Anti-Tampering Act in 1983. For the first time, tampering with consumer products became a federal crime, punishable by heavy prison sentences. The FDA followed suit, introducing new regulations that required all over-the-counter medications to feature tamper-evident packaging. Suddenly, the clear plastic seals, heat-shrink bands, and aluminum foil seals we now tear through without a thought became mandatory. These new layers of protection were designed with one purpose: to restore trust and to make sure such a crime could never go unnoticed again. But the Tylenol murders also cast a long shadow. The Tylenol effect triggered a series of copycat incidents, most infamously in 1986, when more deaths in New York and Washington were traced to cyanide-laced painkillers. Investigators and the public learned a hard lesson. Even as technology advanced, human ingenuity could always find new ways to exploit a system. And yet, from the darkness came resilience. Johnson & Johnson's swift, transparent response set a new standard for corporate crisis management, putting consumer safety above profit. The tragedy forced an entire nation to confront its assumptions about everyday safety. Parents spoke to their children about reading labels, stores educated staff about warning signs, and government agencies began working more closely with the private sector. Perhaps the most sobering lesson of all is this: in a society built on trust, one act of sabotage can shatter confidence overnight. But with vigilance, science, and shared responsibility, those cracks can be repaired. The Tylenol murders left scars, but they also forged new protections, reminders that even in tragedy, change is possible. The Tylenol murders of 1982 remain one of America's most haunting, unsolved crimes, a chilling reminder that even everyday routines can hold unimaginable danger. In the face of tragedy, a community came together, new laws were written, and product safety standards were transformed forever. Though the person responsible was never brought to justice, the lessons learned continue to protect millions each day. This story reminds us, even in the darkest moments, change is possible if we remain vigilant, compassionate, and united. If you found this case compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more true crime mysteries and stories that change the world. Your support helps us bring you more in-depth investigations and untold cases. Stay safe and stay curious.